night did not fall. It lengthened, the city adjusted its pace, and Constantinople learned that survival after loss often begins by doing less, not more, and breathing slowly together. Before you drift any deeper, if this quiet helps you feel safe tonight, you're welcome to stay with us. Subscribing softly keeps this place gentle and lets these nights continue. Now, rest. Constantinople, around the year 900, no longer hurried toward morning. The city had already learned what panic costs and what patience preserves. Generations had passed since the great plagues reshaped its population, yet the memory lingered not as fear, but as structure. The city did not speak of catastrophe anymore. It reorganized itself around the absence left behind. Streets felt wider, not because they had grown, but because fewer people pressed against them. Air moved differently. Sound did not travel as far. Even the night seemed to arrive with less urgency. This was not a city in mourning. Mourning requires attention and performance. This was a city in adjustment. After the plague, Constantinople discovered that excess movement drained energy that could not be easily replaced. Shops learned to close earlier. Households learned that darkness was not an interruption but a signal. The night was no longer something to resist. It became a shared agreement between stone walls, wooden doors, and tired bodies. Breathing slowly was not a metaphor here. Fewer people meant fewer fires burning at once. Smoke thinned, lungs worked less. Lamps burned lower because there was no reason to keep them high. The city found that it could function without announcing itself at every hour. There was a quiet satisfaction in this restraint, though no one would have called it that. It simply felt correct. Constantinople had always been large enough to absorb silence. After the plague, it discovered how useful that silence could be. Streets that once expected crowds now expected nothing, and nothing arrived on time. The night stretched without complaint. Guards walked slower, not from laziness but from understanding. When movement decreases, attention sharpens. Fewer steps meant fewer mistakes. Even authority softened its voice after sunset. Inside homes, the rhythm changed first. Families stopped stretching their days late into the dark, not because they feared the night, but because they respected it. Rest was no longer treated as a pause between obligations. It became a task of its own. Sleeping earlier meant waking steadier. The body recovered quietly without instruction. This was not wellness as philosophy. It was habit shaped by survival. The city learned that breathing slowly meant allowing some spaces to remain unused. Not every street needed to be walked every night. Not every window needed light. Constantinople did not shrink itself. It reduced its strain. Buildings remained standing without demanding purpose. The night held them without judgment. There is a temptation to imagine recovery as noise returning. But here recovery sounded like less. Fewer carts after dusk. Fewer conversations carried into darkness. Fewer interruptions of sleep. The city stopped proving it was alive every hour. It trusted morning would arrive without assistance. This adjustment did not come with ceremony. No proclamation announced that the night would now be longer. It simply became so. People noticed when their bodies stopped resisting sleep, when waking felt less abrupt, when days no longer carried the weight of exhaustion into the evening. The city breathed, and its residents followed. Constantinople after the plague was still a capital. Administration continued, Trade persisted, but none of this required a restless night. The most important work now happened quietly. Recovery rarely announces itself. It arrives as permission to stop. The long night was not empty. It was full of rest. A city that had once measured itself by movement learned to measure itself by stillness, and in that stillness it endured. The streets of Constantinople did not become empty overnight. They learned emptiness the way stone learns weather, slowly, without protest, and without forgetting what once passed across its surface. By the year 900, the avenues no longer anticipated crowds as a default condition. They existed without expectation. This change mattered more than any collapse or reconstruction. A street that expects nothing is rarely disappointed and never rushed. Before the plague, these streets were designed for compression. Bodies moved in layers. Sound stacked itself in the air. Footsteps overlapped until individual movement disappeared into collective motion. Afterward, the same stones remained, but the rhythm dissolved. Space returned. The street did not widen. People simply stopped filling it completely. The city discovered that capacity and usage were not the same thing. At night, this became most visible. The absence of crowds revealed the true scale of Constantinople. Long, straight stretches of road extended without interruption. Intersections waited patiently. Nothing leaned forward demanding participation. The street did not invite. It allowed. That subtle shift changed how people moved through it. Walking at night was no longer about navigating density. It became a conversation with distance. A person could hear their own steps again. This was not comforting at first. Sound returning to the individual can feel exposing, but over time it created familiarity. The street learned each walker, and each walker learned the street. Movement slowed naturally because there was no pressure to keep pace. Merchants adjusted first not out of philosophy but fatigue. Fewer customers after dusk meant fewer reasons to remain open. Lamps were extinguished earlier, shutters closed with practiced efficiency. The street accepted this without resistance. Darkness did not interrupt commerce. Commerce simply respected the boundary. What remained was not abandonment, but alignment. The plague had taught the city something unintentionally valuable. Crowds were not neutral. They consumed air warmth and attention. In their absence, the street cooled evenly. Stone released heat gradually. This made night walking predictable. No sudden pockets of warmth. No unexpected noise. Just consistency. The city began to feel reliable again. There was a mild irony here. Constantinople had been built to impress. Its streets were meant to carry spectacle processions and authority. After the plague, they carried almost nothing, and in doing so, they performed their most important function. They connected without overwhelming. They allowed passage without demanding presence. Guards noticed the change immediately. Patrols no longer pushed through clusters. They moved along edges. Observation replaced enforcement. With fewer people present, the need for display vanished. Authority learned that visibility could be reduced without consequence. Power rested quietly at night, and the streets appreciated the rest. Children born generations after the plague grew up assuming this rhythm was normal. They did not know streets as places of constant negotiation. For them, night streets were calm corridors. Parents allowed movement within limits. The city felt large but not threatening. Absence of crowds meant absence of chaos. This was not innocence, it was adaptation. Sound behaved differently. Without constant voices, even small noises carried weight. A dropped object could be heard across a courtyard. Footsteps echoed briefly, then stopped. The street learned to hold sound and release it gently. Silence was no longer total, but selective. This selectivity created a sense of order without instruction. The city did not mourn the loss of crowds. It repurposed their absence. Streets became routes rather than destinations. You crossed them to reach shelter, not to linger. This reduced unnecessary exposure. Bodies conserved energy. Nights became longer because there was nothing urging them forward. There is a temptation to describe these streets as lonely. That would be inaccurate. Loneliness requires expectation. These streets expected nothing. They existed to be used when needed and ignored when not. This neutrality was their strength. They neither welcomed nor rejected. They simply remained. Travelers noticed the difference immediately. Approaching Constantinople at night felt subdued. The city did not announce itself with noise. It revealed itself through stillness. Those accustomed to livelier capitals found this unsettling. Others found it reassuring. The city made no effort to persuade either group. Street maintenance continued quietly. Stones were replaced, drainage cleared, not because crowds demanded it, but because neglect spreads. The city understood that restraint does not equal abandonment. Care continued without spectacle. This was maintenance as habit, not performance. In winter, the benefits became undeniable. Fewer people outside meant fewer accidents. Ice formed evenly rather than in disturbed patches. Fires were easier to control. The street remained navigable without constant supervision. Darkness ceased to be a problem, requiring solution. It became a condition to work within. There was humor in this if one looked closely. A capital that once prided itself on visibility now hid itself at night with remarkable discipline. Streets wide enough for ceremony now served the quiet dignity of a single passerby. History rarely advertises these reversals. They happen because they work. The absence of crowds also changed memory. Streets no longer carried the residue of previous nights. No lingering smells, no debris. Each evening began nearly clean. This created a sense of reset that benefited the city psychologically, even if no one named it as such. Night erased gently. People learned routes that minimized exposure, short paths, covered passages, familiar corners. The street network shrank perceptually, even as it remained physically vast. This made the city feel manageable again. The mind responds well to limits, especially after generations of loss. What Constantinople achieved was not emptiness but balance. The street did not vanish from life, it withdrew from dominance. This withdrawal allowed other spaces to recover. Homes strengthened, sleep deepened. The night became a partner rather than an obstacle. By the year 900, the streets no longer asked to be filled. They existed in readiness. This readiness sustained the city through uncertainty better than any crowd ever had. A street that waits survives longer than one that demands. And so the long night settled comfortably into stone. Streets carried fewer feet, but more continuity. They did not remember the plague. They remembered what came after, and that memory was quiet. In Constantinople, after the plague, doors did not close because the night was dangerous. They closed because the day was finished. This distinction mattered. Fear creates tension. Completion creates rest. By the year 900, the city had learned to tell the difference, and its doors reflected that knowledge quietly every evening. Earlier centuries had trained people to read doors as signals. Open meant trade, closed meant risk. A barred entrance suggested urgency or threat. After generations shaped by loss, those meanings softened. Doors began to close earlier, not as a defensive gesture, but as a practical one. Closing a door was no longer a reaction. It was a routine. This shift did not happen through policy. No authority instructed households to withdraw. The change emerged from exhaustion. People discovered that remaining open late rarely produced benefit proportional to the effort. Customers thinned. Conversations repeated themselves. Lamps burned for no reason other than habit. Eventually, habit yielded. Wooden doors in the city were thick, not ornate. They were designed to insulate rather than impress. After the plague, their role became more important. A closed door marked the boundary between shared strain and private recovery. Inside, warmth held. Outside, the night moved on without offense. There was mild irony in how little resistance this caused. A city once proud of its constant activity accepted closure with relief. No one protested shorter evenings. No one demanded extended access. The door became an ally. It allowed people to step out of circulation without explanation. Closing doors early also changed sound. The city became quieter, not because people vanished, but because their voices stayed contained. Noise retreated into walls. Streets lost their echo. This quiet did not feel imposed, it felt earned. In previous generations, doors had often remained open as reassurance. Light spilling into the street signaled presence and safety. After the plague, presence itself was no longer comforting. Survival had taught the city that closeness carried cost. A closed door meant controlled exposure. This was not isolation, it was calibration. Shops adapted quickly. Merchants realized that scarcity of customers made extended hours inefficient. Closing early preserved energy. Goods remained. Business resumed in the morning without loss. Doors shut, not in disappointment but in confidence that tomorrow would arrive. Homes followed the same logic. Families stopped keeping doors ajar to invite late visitors. Social life shifted earlier. Evening gatherings compressed. By nightfall, most households had already withdrawn. The city learned that connection did not require constant availability. There is a subtle humor in imagining a capital learning restraint. Constantinople had once defined itself through openness to trade, movement, and influence. Now it defined itself by selective closure. Doors became filters rather than barriers. They decided when interaction ended without drama. Locks existed but were used sparingly. A closed door did not imply suspicion. In many cases, it was left unlatched. Closure signaled rest, not paranoia. The city trusted its own rhythm enough to relax its grip. This trust extended outward. Neighbors learned not to knock after certain hours. Late visits became rare, not because rules forbade them, but because norms replaced need. The door communicated clearly. Silence answered before the knock could form. Doors also changed how time was experienced. When streets lost their visual access to interior life, night felt deeper. Darkness gained texture. The city no longer leaked light unnecessarily. This allowed sleep to arrive sooner and stay longer. Even institutions adapted. Administrative buildings closed fully after dusk. Work retreated indoors. Authority did not patrol its own presence. It rested. This was not weakness. It was efficiency, learned the hard way. The plague had reduced population but increased awareness. Fewer people meant each one mattered more. Preserving strength became communal logic. Doors closing early protected not just individuals but the city as a system. There were no speeches praising this change. No chronicler announced the age of early doors. It simply happened because it worked. Cities rarely justify what keeps them alive. Visitors sometimes misunderstood. To an outsider, early closures suggested decline. Empty streets and shut doors could be mistaken for fear or decay. The city did not correct them. Explanation costs energy. Constantinople conserved it. The door became a boundary that separated noise from recovery. Inside, bodies relaxed. Outside, night continued without intrusion. This separation stabilized daily rhythms. People woke less exhausted. Illness spread more slowly. The city grew quieter and healthier without intending to be virtuous. Craftspeople appreciated the change. Working by lamplight late into the night strained eyes and patience. Earlier closure preserved skill. Tools rested, hands recovered. Production improved not through intensity but through rest. Children grew up associating closed doors with safety rather than restriction. Night meant home. Darkness meant stillness. This normalized rest as a shared expectation rather than a personal choice. Even hospitality adjusted. Inns closed common rooms earlier. Guests learned to retire. Conversation shortened. Travel adapted to daylight. The city coordinated itself without central command. The most telling sign of success was the lack of complaint. No movement arose to reopen the night. No nostalgia demanded longer hours. People remembered what exhaustion felt like and chose differently. In this way, doors became instruments of memory. Each closure echoed generations that had learned what exposure costs. The city did not dramatize this knowledge. It practiced it nightly. By 900, Constantinople had developed a quiet agreement with itself. Night belonged indoors. Doors enforced this agreement gently. They did not slam. They closed. The city did not fear what lay outside. It simply understood that survival required boundaries. Doors marked those boundaries with wood, iron, and habit. And because they closed without fear, they allowed the city to open again each morning without loss. After the plague, Constantinople did not lose its light. It learned how heavy light could be. By the year 900, the city understood that illumination was not free. Every flame demanded oil. Every wick consumed labor. Every bright room asked the body to stay awake longer than it needed to. The night did not become darker because the city declined. It became darker because the city learned to stop performing wakefulness. In earlier centuries, light had carried meaning beyond its function. A lit space suggested prosperity. A bright street implied safety. A glowing house announced social presence. After generations shaped by loss, those signals felt excessive. The city no longer needed to reassure itself constantly that it was alive. Survival had made that obvious enough. Oil lamps remained everywhere. They were not abandoned or forgotten. They were simply treated with restraint. Lamps were lit when a task required vision and extinguished the moment it did not. No one kept a flame burning out of habit alone. This shift did not come from scarcity. It came from fatigue. The plague had reduced population, but it had also reduced tolerance for waste. Wasted effort felt heavier in a city that remembered emptiness. Light became one of the first things to be measured honestly. Did this room need to be bright right now? Often the answer was no. Homes changed first. Evenings shortened gently, lamps burned lower, shadows softened walls, eyes adjusted. Children learned early the darkness was not a threat. It was a signal that the day had ended. Sleep arrived sooner, not because people forced it, but because the environment invited it. This invitation mattered. Before the plague nights often extended artificially, light stretched time. People lingered because they could see. Afterward, lingering felt unnecessary. Conversation repeated itself. Work slowed. The flame remained, but its purpose disappeared. Eventually, the city let the flame go. There is quiet irony in this transformation. Constantinople had once been defined by spectacle. Its monuments reflected firelight across stone and water. By the year 900, even monumental spaces accepted darkness without complaint. Grandeur no longer demanded illumination after sunset. Public buildings closed earlier, courtyards fell silent, administrative halls dimmed. Authority learned that it did not need to remain visible to remain effective. Power rested at night, and the city slept better because of it. Streets changed profoundly. With fewer lamps spilling outward, darkness became consistent rather than chaotic. This consistency improved navigation. Shadows behaved predictably. The eye adapted. Movement slowed. Accidents decreased. Darkness trained caution without instruction. Guards adjusted their patrols. Lanterns were carried but kept low. Light was directed downward toward the ground, not outward toward the crowd. Authority learned to see without announcing itself. This reduced tension. Night no longer felt supervised. It felt held. Merchants followed the same rhythm. Shops extinguished lamps when trade ended. There was no attempt to attract customers through brightness alone. Commerce accepted its hours. When the door closed, the light followed. This preserved oil and patience alike. The city discovered something subtle. Brightness encourages activity. Dimness encourages completion. As nights grew darker, tasks naturally concluded earlier. Bodies rested. The city began to function on cycles that aligned with daylight rather than resisted it. There was no campaign against light, no sermons praised darkness. The change spread because it worked. Sleep improved, illness decreased, irritability softened. People woke steadier. No one connected these benefits to lamps. They simply noticed life felt less strained. Religious spaces adjusted carefully. Candles burned during necessary rituals and were extinguished afterward. Continuous illumination was no longer assumed. Sacredness did not depend on brightness. Silence and shadow carried weight enough. Children grew up in rooms that dimmed gradually rather than abruptly. This taught the body how to descend into rest. Fear of darkness did not develop. Darkness became familiar. Night was no longer something to endure. It was something to enter. Craftspeople benefited immediately. Fine work moved to daylight. Eyes rested at night. Fewer mistakes occurred. Tools lasted longer. Productivity improved without urgency. Light stopped being stretched beyond its useful hours. Administrators noticed changes too. Meetings shortened. Decisions improved. Fatigue decreased. A city that rests thinks more clearly. This was not philosophy, it was observation. Celebrations became more distinct. Because ordinary nights were dim, festive light stood out. Contrast returned meaning to brightness. The city learned that constant illumination flattens experience. There was humor in this restraint. A capital once proud of its brilliance now took pride in knowing when to turn the flame down. Visitors sometimes mistook this for decline. The city did not correct them. Explanation consumes energy. Light also carried social implications. Wealthy households did not keep lamps burning longer than others. Excess illumination drew no admiration. It suggested waste. In a city shaped by survival, waste was quietly discouraged. Night became darker but safer, not because danger vanished, but because behavior adjusted. People moved less. They stayed home. They slept. Darkness did not need to be conquered. It needed to be respected. Bedrooms became the center of nighttime life. Lamps were extinguished fully rather than left glowing. Sleep deepened, dreams lengthened. Waking felt less abrupt. Over time, this changed how people experienced age, illness, and recovery. The city did not write this down. Chroniclers record events, not habits. But habits sustained Constantinople more reliably than spectacle ever had. The memory of plague did not remain as fear. It remained as discipline. Light became something one could put down. This mattered. A city that can release its tools survives longer than one that clings to them. By the year 900, darkness no longer needed justification. Lamps rested. Oil was saved. The night unfolded without apology. Constantinople learned that light is most powerful when it knows when to stop. In this quiet discipline, the city endured, not by shining longer, but by resting sooner. Darkness did not erase Constantinople, it preserved it. After the plague, Constantinople did not become silent. It became selective. By the year 900, the city no longer treated noise as proof of life. Sound learned its place. It learned when to appear, and more importantly, when to withdraw. This adjustment shaped the night as deeply as closed doors or dimmed lamps. Before, lost sound had filled space aggressively. Voices overlapped, carts rattled late, animals called from courtyards. The city announced itself constantly. Noise reassured people that activity continued and that they were not alone. After generations shaped by disappearance, that reassurance lost its power. Constant sound began to feel like strain. The plague changed how people listened. When population thinned, every sound carried farther. Footsteps echoed longer. A cough lingered in memory. The city learned that noise had weight. It could exhaust as easily as labor. Quiet became a form of conservation. This did not happen through command. No authority ordered silence. The change came from bodies learning their limits. Voices softened naturally. Conversation shortened. Laughter retreated indoors earlier. The city stopped competing with itself for attention. Night revealed this most clearly. As lamps dimmed, sound followed. Without visual stimulation, people spoke less. The absence of crowds meant fewer overlapping noises. Each sound stood alone briefly, then faded. The city discovered that this pattern felt stable. Streets changed character. Before the plague, nighttime streets carried residual noise from the day. Trade lingered. Movement continued. Afterward, streets learned to let sound pass through rather than accumulate. A single step might echo and then vanish completely. Silence returned quickly. Guards adjusted their presence. Patrols no longer relied on loud calls or metal clatter. Equipment was handled carefully. Footsteps were measured. Authority learned that announcing itself was unnecessary. Observation replaced noise. Merchants adapted without discussion. Closing earlier meant fewer evening conversations. Shutters lowered quietly. Goods were secured with minimal disturbance. Commerce withdrew without ceremony. Sound retreated alongside light. Homes underwent the most significant change. Evening gatherings grew shorter. Families spoke more softly as the night deepened. Children learned to lower their voices instinctively, not from fear, but from environment. The city trained its residents gently. There is subtle irony here. Constantinople had once been famous for debate proclamation and crowd noise. After the plague, it became known for controlled quiet at night. The city did not lose its voice. It learned to rest it. Silence did not mean emptiness. It meant spacing. Sound appeared briefly when needed, then dissolved. This rhythm allowed the mind to relax. Constant noise keeps the body alert. Selective sound allows it to descend. Sleep benefited immediately. Without late-night disturbances, people slept deeper. Dreams lengthened. Waking felt less abrupt. Over time, health improved quietly. No one attributed this to reduced noise. They simply noticed rest felt more complete. Animals responded too. Dogs barked less. Livestock settled earlier. Without constant human noise, animals adjusted their rhythms. Night became truly nocturnal again, rather than extended daylight. The city learned that sound invites participation. Noise draws attention. Attention invites movement. Movement consumes energy. Reducing sound reduced unnecessary activity. This was not enforced. It was accepted. Even celebrations changed. Festive noise became contained. Music ended earlier. Loudness became temporary rather than continuous. This made celebration more distinct rather than less joyful. Contrast restored meaning. Religious life adapted carefully. Night chants grew rare. Bells were used sparingly. Sacred sound remained powerful precisely because it was limited. Silence framed it. Craftspeople appreciated quieter nights. Tools rested. Workshops closed fully. Hands recovered. Precision improved. The city learned that productivity benefits from silence as much as from effort. Travelers noticed immediately. Approaching Constantinople at night felt different. The city did not hum continuously. It paused. Some found this unsettling. Others felt relief. The city did not adjust to their expectations. Sound also shaped memory. Nights were no longer remembered by events, but by continuity. One night resembled the next. This predictability calmed the population. Anxiety feeds on irregularity. Silence smoothed edges. There was humor in how little was said about this transformation. A capital learning to be quiet would not make a proud announcement about it. The city simply lowered its voice and waited. Children grew up without associating night with noise. Darkness and quiet belonged together. This shaped how they understood rest. Silence did not feel empty. It felt full of permission. The absence of sound also improved attention. When something did break the quiet, it mattered. A call for help was heard. A warning carried clearly. Silence increased responsiveness rather than dulling it. The city did not become fragile, it became efficient. By reducing unnecessary sound, Constantinople preserved energy for moments that required action. Nighttime arguments declined. Without crowds and noise, conflict found fewer opportunities to escalate. Calm spread not through virtue but through environment. Even the sea responded. Harbors quieted earlier. Waves replaced human noise. Sailors slept. Ships rested. Trade adjusted to daylight. This transformation left no monument. Silence rarely does. Yet it sustained the city more reliably than any proclamation. By the year 900, Constantinople had learned that sound is a resource. Used constantly, it drains. Used carefully, it strengthens. The city chose care. Night became a period of acoustic rest. Streets held silence easily. Homes contained their sounds. Bodies relaxed into stillness. The memory of plague remained, not as fear, but as discipline. Noise had once signaled life. Now quiet preserved it. In learning when to stop speaking, the city learned how to continue. Silence did not end Constantinople, it allowed it to endure. After the plague, Constantinople did not rebuild its homes in dramatic ways. Walls did not suddenly grow thicker. Roofs did not change their shape overnight. What changed was how houses were used, how interior space was respected, and how the night was invited inside rather than held at bay. By the year 900, the city's homes were no longer places people merely returned to. They were places designed to hold long nights, without strain. Before the great losses, homes functioned as intervals. They were places between movement. People passed through them on the way to markets, gatherings, and work that extended well into the evening. After the plague, the home became the destination. The night shifted inward. Streets emptied earlier because interiors mattered more. This change was not philosophical. It was bodily. People were tired in a way that could not be argued with. Extended exposure to illness, loss, and uncertainty had taught families that endurance depended on recovery. Recovery required stillness. Stillness required space that could support it. Rooms became quieter not because they were redesigned, but because they were repurposed. Sleeping areas moved away from entrances. Shared rooms darkened earlier. Fires burned lower and longer instead of brighter and shorter. Heat was preserved rather than displayed. Furniture arrangements shifted subtly. Mats and bedding were placed with care. Drafts were blocked. Windows were covered earlier. These were small decisions repeated nightly until they became habit. The home learned how to close itself gently. There was a quiet irony in this inward turn. Constantinople had always been outward-facing. Trade, diplomacy, and spectacle defined it. After the plague, the city survived by turning inward at night without apology. Homes became the true infrastructure of endurance. Families spent more time together in smaller spaces. Conversation shortened naturally. Silence lengthened. The home did not demand interaction. It allowed presence without performance. This mattered more than comfort. Sleep changed first. Without late noise and excessive light, bodies rested deeper. Children slept through the night more often. Adults woke less frequently. The home absorbed fatigue instead of amplifying it. Bedrooms became central, not luxurious but intentional. Bedding was layered. Fabrics were chosen for warmth rather than appearance. Nothing here was symbolic. Everything served rest. Kitchens quieted earlier. Cooking shifted toward daylight. Night meals became simpler. Heavy preparation at night was avoided. The home learned that digestion, too, benefits from rest. Storage spaces gained importance. Food, fuel, and tools were organized carefully. This reduced nighttime movement. The less one needed to search after dark, the more one could remain still. Stillness was the goal. The plague had taught the city something uncomfortable. Crowding spreads more than sound, it spreads exhaustion. Homes adjusted by creating personal distance within shared walls. Not isolation, just room to breathe. Multi-generational households learned to coordinate their rhythms. Elders rested earlier, children followed. The home stopped forcing everyone into the same schedule. Flexibility improved harmony. There was no stigma attached to early retreat. Staying indoors at night did not signal fear or laziness. It signaled wisdom. The city quietly respected those who rested. Visitors sometimes misread this. Quiet homes and closed doors suggested absence. In truth, they were full of breathing, full of sleep, full of people choosing not to be seen. Fire management changed too. Flames were treated as companions, not centerpieces. Hearths warmed rooms evenly, sparks were controlled. Night fires were predictable and safe. This reduced accidents dramatically. The home became a place where time slowed. Clocks mattered less. Lamps dimmed. Night progressed without urgency. People stopped measuring the dark. Children grew up associating home with quiet continuity. Night was not frightening. It was expected. This shaped temperament. Anxiety decreased. Patience increased. Illness recovery improved. Resting at home became normal rather than exceptional. People did not push themselves back into activity prematurely. The home allowed weakness without judgment. Workshops attached to homes closed fully at night. Tools rested. Hands recovered. Craft quality improved over time. The city learned that productivity depends on rest as much as effort. Domestic rituals simplified. Night prayers shortened. Storytelling became brief. The home favored repetition over novelty. Familiarity calmed the mind. Homes also buffered sound. Thick walls and closed shutters contained noise. This protected neighbors. The city learned that private noise is less disruptive than public noise. Homes absorbed sound the way they absorbed people. The absence of nighttime visitors reduced tension. Social obligations moved to daylight. Night belonged to the household. This reduced fatigue and resentment. Even animals benefited. Pets settled earlier. Livestock quieted. The home synchronized living beings into a shared rhythm. There was humor in how unremarkable this was. No one declared a new domestic philosophy. The city simply stopped fighting the night. Homes followed suit. Over generations, these habits solidified. Children raised in such homes did not remember anything else. For them, long nights indoors felt natural. The plague faded into history, but its lessons remained embedded in walls and routines. Constantinople did not survive because its homes were grand. It survived because they were sufficient. They did not demand energy. They preserved it. By the year 900, the city's nights were held inside its houses. Streets rested, doors closed, lamps dimmed, sound softened. And inside homes, bodies recovered quietly. The long night no longer threatened the city. It passed gently through roofs and walls and left behind rested people ready for morning. After the plague, Constantinople did not teach its people how to sleep. It allowed them to sleep. This difference mattered. By the year 900, rest was no longer something squeezed between obligations. It became a central activity around which the night quietly organized itself. Bodies that had learned to endure learned instead to recover. Before, lost sleep had often been shallow, not because people lacked beds or shelter, but because the city itself remained restless. Sound leaked through walls, light extended evenings. Movement continued long after the body asked to stop. Sleep existed, but it was interrupted. The plague did not cause exhaustion, it revealed it. Generations shaped by illness and absence learned to listen differently to their own limits. Fatigue stopped being a personal failure. It became a shared condition, when many bodies reach the same limit simultaneously. Society adapts or collapses. Constantinople adapted. Sleep deepened first among those who could afford to withdraw early. Merchants closed sooner. Craftspeople stopped forcing work by lamplight. Families dimmed rooms and lowered voices. Once rest proved useful, it spread across classes without persuasion. The city discovered that sleep does not need encouragement, it needs permission. When streets quieted and doors closed, bodies responded immediately. Breathing slowed, muscles released. The mind stopped scanning for interruption. Night ceased to be a negotiation. Children benefited most visibly. Without late noise and light, they slept longer and more consistently. Growth improved, illness decreased. Parents noticed fewer nighttime disturbances. This reinforced the new rhythm. Sleep became something the city protected indirectly. Adults followed more slowly. Habits resist change. Yet exhaustion is persuasive. As nights grew quieter and darker, the effort required to remain awake increased. People stopped resisting. Sleep arrived earlier. Dreams lengthened. Waking felt less abrupt. There was a quiet irony in this. Constantinople had once been admired for its endurance. Now it preserved itself by stopping. A capital that slept deeply was not impressive to outsiders. It was effective. Sleep patterns shifted across the city. Fragmented rest became less common. Night waking decreased. People slept in longer, continuous stretches. This improved mood, attention, and resilience without anyone naming these effects. Illness recovery improved dramatically. Rest became part of treatment rather than an afterthought. Those weakened by disease were allowed to remain in bed without pressure to resume activity prematurely. The city learned that forcing recovery often delays it. The home supported this change. Bedding improved gradually. Layers were added, drafts reduced, fire warmth stabilized. These were modest adjustments repeated nightly until sleep deepened naturally. Even social expectations changed. Staying awake late lost its prestige. Endurance stopped being admired. Those who rested were not judged. The city quietly redefined strength. The plague had erased many lives. It also erased illusions about limitless stamina. Bodies had limits. Respecting those limits extended survival. Sleep became the most reliable form of maintenance. Work schedules adapted. Morning activity began later. Productivity shifted rather than declined. Focus improved. Mistakes decreased. Rested bodies perform better even when hours shorten. There was no central plan, no doctrine of sleep. The city learned through practice. When people slept better, everything else improved. Trade stabilized, conflict decreased, health improved quietly, nighttime anxiety diminished. A restless city breeds restless minds. As the environment softened, the nervous system followed. Fear lost its fuel. Darkness no longer signaled vulnerability. It signaled rest. Even dreams changed. With deeper sleep, dreams grew longer and more coherent. People woke remembering them. This mattered culturally, even if no one articulated it. The inner life regained space. There was humor in how obvious this seemed in retrospect. Of course, people sleep better when the city allows it. Yet before the plague, the city had not allowed it. Progress had demanded wakefulness. Survival demanded restraint. The city also learned to tolerate brief awakenings without alarm. Night waking no longer triggered activity. People remained still. Sleep resumed. This prevented escalation. Calm reinforced calm. Children learned from example. Adults who rested modeled permission. Generations grew up without glorifying exhaustion. This shaped temperament. Patience increased. Impulsiveness softened. Animals followed suit. Dogs slept through the night more often. Livestock settled earlier. The entire living system synchronized around deeper rest. Travelers noticed the difference. Lodging felt quieter. Night disturbances were rare. The city did not entertain at night, it rested. Visitors adjusted or moved on. Medical practitioners observed improved outcomes. Rest supported healing. The body repaired itself when allowed uninterrupted sleep. This knowledge circulated informally. The city also reduced nighttime labor that disrupted sleep. Heavy transport paused. Loud tasks moved to daylight. This protected rest indirectly. There was no nostalgia for sleepless nights. People remembered exhaustion too clearly. Sleep became associated with survival rather than indulgence. Religious practice adapted subtly. Night vigils diminished. Rest was no longer seen as spiritual weakness. The body was respected as part of creation rather than obstacle. Even authority slept. Officials withdrew at night. Decision-making waited for morning. This reduced error. Governance benefited from rest. The most striking change was how unremarkable it felt. Deep sleep became normal. Normality stabilized the city more than any reform. By the year 900, Constantinople was a city that slept. Not constantly, not excessively, but deeply enough to recover. The long night did its work quietly. Bodies that slept more deeply woke steadier. Days improved, nights followed. The cycle reinforced itself. The plague no longer haunted the city through fear. It lingered through discipline. Sleep was the discipline that kept the city alive. Constantinople did not survive because it stayed awake. It survived because it rested when rest was possible. And in those long nights, bodies healed without ceremony. Breath slowed, muscles loosened, minds released their grip. The city slept, and in sleeping endured. After the plague, Constantinople no longer treated the night as an adversary. It stopped rehearsing danger after sunset. By the year 900, the city had learned that the night was not the most fragile part of the day. It was the most necessary. What had once been feared as exposure was now understood as recovery. This shift did not occur because danger disappeared. Risks remained. Illness still existed. Crime did not vanish. But perception changed. The city realized that constant vigilance exhausted more people than it protected. A population that never rests. eventually creates the very instability it fears. Before the great losses, the night had been framed as a problem to manage. Light extended work, noise reassured presence, movement signaled control. After the plague, these strategies felt hollow. They consumed energy without restoring it. The city learned that protection without recovery is temporary. Night became a boundary, not a line of defense, but a pause in strain. The city did not attempt to dominate darkness anymore. It allowed it. Darkness ceased to be interpreted as absence. It became a container. People noticed this change not through policy, but through sensation. When the city grew quieter, the body responded. Muscles loosened, breath deepened. The nervous system stopped scanning constantly. The night stopped demanding attention. There was an unspoken understanding that night was no longer for proving endurance. It was for letting systems reset. Streets emptied not out of fear, but out of agreement. Homes held people gently. The city leaned inward. Risk did not disappear. It became manageable. Fewer people outside meant fewer conflicts. Reduced movement lowered accidents. Darkness no longer amplified chaos. It reduced opportunity for it. Recovery became the dominant function of night. This was not naivete. Guards still walked, doors still closed, fires were still watched. But the underlying logic changed. Safety no longer depended on activity. It depended on rest. The plague had taught a harsh lesson. Bodies pushed too long break. Minds held in constant alert lose clarity. Communities that never pause fragment. Night became the city's way of preventing collapse. People learned to stop narrating the night as threat. Stories changed. Parents no longer warned children excessively. Night was described as quiet rather than dangerous. Language shaped perception. Perception shaped behavior. There was mild irony in this reversal. A city once admired for its vigilance survived by relaxing it. Control loosened, stability increased. The city discovered that risk decreases when recovery increases. Medical knowledge reinforced this quietly. Rest improved resistance. Sleep strengthened the body's ability to recover from illness. Night supported health more reliably than constant motion ever had. Nighttime became predictable. Predictability reduces anxiety. When people know what the night will bring, they stop imagining worse alternatives. The city provided consistency rather than excitement. Harbors quieted earlier. Ships rested. Sailors slept. Trade adjusted to daylight rhythms. The sea itself felt calmer when human noise receded. The city learned that darkness does not require occupation. A street can remain empty and still be secure. Movement was no longer equated with safety. Stillness earned trust. Families adjusted routines. Evening meals became earlier. Night preparation simplified. The transition into darkness smoothed rather than jolted. This reduced stress. Night as recovery also changed how people handled illness. The sick were allowed uninterrupted rest. Nighttime visits were minimized. Healing accelerated without intervention. There was no public celebration of this insight. Recovery rarely earns ceremony. It operates quietly. The city simply felt better over time. Children raised in this environment did not associate night with threat. They associated it with quiet continuity. This shaped temperament. Fear decreased, patience increased. Even animals sensed the shift. Night became restful across species. Barking decreased. Livestock settled. The living system synchronized around rest. Risk management improved paradoxically. When something unusual occurred at night, it stood out clearly against the quiet. Attention sharpened. Silence amplified important signals rather than dulling them. The city also learned that constant lighting creates blind spots. Darkness reveals movement through contrast. Guards adjusted accordingly. Visibility improved despite reduced illumination. Night became a shared agreement. Everyone participated. This collective participation reinforced trust. A city that rests together stabilizes together. There was humor in how simple this was. The solution to constant strain was to stop. The city had needed catastrophe to permit itself that insight. Foreign visitors often misunderstood. They expected drama at night. Instead, they found restraint. The city did not attempt to impress them. It preserved itself. Night also altered memory. Days blended gently into one another. Trauma softened. Recovery erased sharp edges over time. The city stopped demanding productivity from every hour. This changed identity. Constantinople became less performative and more sustainable. Authority adapted. Night decrees diminished. Decisions waited for morning. Governance improved when rested minds led it. The plague receded into history, but its lesson remained. Night is not a weakness. It is a mechanism. By the year 900, the city had stopped asking the night to justify itself. Darkness did its work quietly. Night healed what daylight strained. Muscles repaired. Minds reset. Systems recalibrated. Risk did not vanish. It lost dominance. Recovery took precedence. Constantinople endured not by conquering night, but by trusting it. The long night became the city's most reliable ally. In that trust, the city stabilized. In that stillness, it continued. Night did not threaten Constantinople. It sustained it. After the plague, Constantinople did not fall silent in a dramatic way. It did not empty itself of sound, as if morning had frozen the city in place. What happened was quieter and more permanent. The city reduced how often it spoke. By the year 900, fewer voices were needed for daily life to continue, and continuity became stronger, precisely because it relied less on constant expression. Before loss, the city had been loud by necessity and by habit. Markets relied on shouting to move goods. Authority relied on proclamation to establish presence. Social life filled streets and courtyards with overlapping conversation. Noise confirmed that the city was functioning. Silence suggested interruption. A quiet space invited concern. After generations shaped by disappearance, this relationship reversed. Silence stopped signaling danger. Noise stopped signaling stability. People learned the constant sound drained energy without sustaining systems. The city adjusted not through decree, but through exhaustion. Population decline changed acoustics first. Fewer bodies meant fewer overlapping sounds. Voices traveled farther. Individual footsteps could be distinguished. This awareness altered behavior. People spoke less because each word carried farther and lingered longer. Silence became practical. This did not weaken social bonds, it concentrated them. Families interacted more closely. Neighborhoods relied on recognition rather than volume. Familiarity replaced announcement. The city learned that relationships survive better when they are not constantly performed. Streets reflected this immediately. Without continuous chatter, they became readable. Movement was legible. Direction could be given once rather than repeated. The city gained clarity. Fewer voices reduced confusion. Markets adapted quietly, haggling shortened. Prices stabilized through routine rather than negotiation. Buyers and sellers recognized one another. Transactions became efficient. Noise had once compensated for uncertainty. Familiarity removed the need. Continuity shifted from expression to repetition. The same stalls opened, the same routes were walked, the same gestures completed exchanges. The city functioned because people did the same things again and again without narrating them. This repetition altered memory. In a loud city, days blur together. In a quieter one, patterns become visible. People remembered sequences rather than events. Continuity was felt as reliability rather than excitement. The plague had removed many lives. It also removed the illusion that constant communication is required for stability. The city continued because its systems did not depend on endless explanation. Homes became quieter spaces, not emotionally withdrawn, but acoustically restrained. Families did not fill silence out of discomfort. Silence became shared. Conversation occurred when necessary and stopped when complete. This reduced fatigue. Children raised in this environment learned to listen before speaking. Patience developed early, impulsive speech decreased, attention lengthened. This shaped temperament across generations. Night intensified these changes. With fewer voices after sunset, continuity became visible. The same patterns repeated night after night. Doors closed, lamps dimmed, streets emptied. Predictability reduced anxiety. Public life adapted accordingly. Speeches shortened. Announcements decreased. Authority relied more on routine enforcement than verbal assertion. Governance became procedural. The city functioned through habit. There was irony in this restraint. Constantinople had once been celebrated for rhetoric, debate, and public argument. After the plague, it survived by speaking less. Eloquence yielded to endurance. Religious practice reflected the same shift. Public declarations softened. Rituals continued without spectacle. Faith persisted through repetition rather than proclamation. Silence did not weaken belief, it stabilized it. Reduced noise changed conflict dynamics. Arguments found fewer audiences. Escalation slowed. Disputes resolved earlier or faded. Silence absorbed tension that noise once amplified. Travelers noticed the difference. Constantinople felt composed, not empty, composed. The city did not perform itself for visitors. It continued at its own pace. Continuity also preserved skills. Crafts survived because they were practiced daily, not advertised. Apprentices learned quietly. Knowledge passed hand to hand. Skill depends on repetition, not applause. Architecture reinforced this. Buildings remained useful without constant occupation. A structure does not need daily celebration to endure. It needs maintenance. The city understood this intuitively. Fewer voices meant fewer rumors. Panic spread more slowly. Information traveled deliberately. Accuracy improved. Stability increased. Night silence strengthened this effect. Without constant commentary, fear lost momentum. Anxiety requires echo. Silence deprived it. The memory of plague remained, but speech about it diminished. People stopped recounting loss endlessly. They lived instead. Continuity requires forgetting as much as remembering. Children born long after the plague did not inherit trauma through stories. They inherited routines. Routines preserved stability more effectively than memory alone. Workplaces adjusted, instruction shortened, tasks repeated. Skill replaced explanation. The city functioned on muscle memory rather than constant verbal coordination. Music remained but became intentional. Sound regained meaning through rarity. Silence framed it. Festivals still occurred. Noise returned briefly, then receded. Contrast preserved joy without exhausting the city. The city learned that silence is not emptiness. It is capacity. It holds potential without forcing it. Continuity became the city's defining trait. Not innovation, not expansion, continuity. Doing enough and repeating it reliably. Authority benefited. Fewer proclamations were required. Law became habit. Compliance followed predictability rather than fear. The absence of constant voice allowed grief to soften. Loss did not require daily articulation. Healing occurred quietly over time. By the year 900, Constantinople had become a city that did not explain itself constantly. It simply continued. Streets held fewer voices but more memory. Homes held fewer conversations but deeper rest. Continuity did not announce itself, it persisted, and in that persistence the city endured. After the plague, Constantinople did not rebuild itself through abundance. It did not attempt to replace loss with more noise, more light, more movement, more proof. By the year 900, the city had learned something that sounds simple and then quietly rearranges an entire society. Not everything that can be done should be done. Not every hour needs to be filled. Not every corner needs to be lit. Not every public space needs to be busy to be real. The capital endured not because it expanded in all directions, but because it refused the kinds of excess that burn a city from the inside. Before loss, excess had been a language. It said, "We are here, we are strong, we are awake, we can afford to keep going." It was the language of a city that believed continuity required constant demonstration. Markets that lingered late into the evening were not only selling goods, they were selling reassurance. Public processions were not only ceremonies, they were public reminders that authority could still move through the streets and be seen. Lamps burning long after the tasks were finished were not only practical, they were a public statement that darkness would not decide the schedule. After loss, those statements started to sound expensive. Not morally expensive, physically expensive. A city that has learned what it feels like to have fewer hands, fewer bodies, fewer nights of easy sleep, also learns to look at effort the way it looks at oil in a lamp. You do not pour it out just because you enjoy the shine. So the refusal of excess began quietly, in places that rarely appear in grand histories. It began in shopkeepers deciding to close when trade ended instead of when pride ended. It began in households deciding that a dim room was not a failure, it was a plan. It began in the small relief of not having to keep talking after the day had already exhausted itself. This was not austerity as performance. No one pinned virtue to it. It was simply the most efficient way to keep tomorrow available. The city did not become poor in spirit. It became honest in practice. It stopped confusing intensity with strength. It stopped treating activity as the only sign of health. It learned slowly that systems survive through repeatable habits, and repeatable habits require restraint. A habit that demands too much collapses. A habit that asks for only what it truly needs can continue for years and then generations without the city having to constantly rescue itself. Night made this visible. In a city that refuses excess, the night is allowed to do what it is meant to do. It lowers the volume. It shortens the list of obligations. It provides an ending. Constantinople began accepting endings more easily. Shops closed without dragging their feet. Streets emptied without embarrassment. People withdrew indoors without feeling they had failed to live fully. The day ended because it was finished. The night was not a second shift. It was recovery. This affected governance too. A city addicted to excess keeps its officials awake and then wonders why decisions become poor. By the year 900, more decisions waited for morning. Not because problems vanished at dusk, but because solutions improve when the mind is rested. Administration became more procedural and less theatrical. Paperwork continued. Records continued. Taxes continued. The city was not abandoning structure. It was abandoning urgency when urgency was unnecessary. That alone reduced errors, reduced conflict, reduced the kind of careless friction that accumulates when people are pushed beyond their capacity. Commerce also recalibrated. Markets still functioned, but they did not need to sound like a public competition for attention every hour. Trade became more predictable and less performative. Inventory practices shifted toward what could be stored safely and moved reliably. Waste became less acceptable, not as a moral stain, but as a practical warning sign. Waste means miscalculation. Miscalculation becomes fragility. The city did not want fragility. Craft production benefited. Artisans stopped forcing precision work into the late night. In a bright workshop at midnight, everything looks possible until the mistake appears the next day. The refusal of excess here was simple. Stop when the eyes are tired. Stop when the hand begins to drift. Stop when the flame becomes more of a distraction than a help. Quality improved quietly. Tools lasted longer. Hands recovered. And because hands recovered, work continued steadily. The city did not need heroic productivity. It needed sustainable productivity. The same logic shaped public spaces. Constantinople did not keep its squares awake just to reassure itself that the city had not changed. Public spaces rested. Monuments faded into shadow at night without losing meaning. A statue does not require an audience every hour. A column does not need lamps to remain upright. The city learned that permanence is not the same as constant visibility. This was a relief. It meant the city could stop spending itself on appearances. Even celebration changed. Festivals still happened, but they became more bounded. Noise returned, then ended. Light surged, then dimmed. In a city that refuses excess, celebration becomes more distinct because it is not constant. Contrast returns. Brightness becomes a choice rather than a default. Joy becomes something you notice rather than something you are required to maintain. There is a certain practical kindness in that. You cannot demand a crowd's energy every night and expect people to remain whole. Homes, too, reflected this refusal. Interiors did not expand into extravagance. They prioritized warmth and rest. Space was used deliberately. The goal was not to impress a visitor at midnight. The goal was to keep a family healthy through winter and through long nights. Bedding was layered. Drafts were managed. Fires were moderated. The home did not glow like a public stage. It held its light carefully and put it away when done. Social life compressed. Gatherings shortened. People stopped proving affection by staying awake longer than they could tolerate. They stopped proving loyalty by lingering past exhaustion. The city quietly learned that friendship does not require sleep deprivation. People left earlier, and they left with less irritation. That alone preserved relationships. In a society recovering from loss, preserved relationships are more valuable than extended conversation. Clothing and public display adjusted too. Nighttime attire became more practical. Comfort mattered, warmth mattered, movement mattered. A city refusing excess does not waste energy dressing for a stage that no longer exists. This did not eliminate elegance. It simply relocated it into the day, where light is free and the body can afford to care. The refusal of excess also touched emotion. Public grief softened, not because the city forgot, but because it stopped repeating sorrow loudly. Continuous mourning exhausts the living. Constantinople did not deny loss. It stopped performing it. Healing requires quiet. A city that insists on constant emotional intensity becomes unstable. The city chose steadiness. This steadiness improved risk management in ways that would have pleased any careful mind, even if no one wrote it down. Systems with buffer endure shock better. A population that rests has resilience. A city that does not spend all its energy on nightly performance can respond when a real emergency arrives. In that sense, refusing excess was not just about comfort. It was about survival capacity. The city was building margin, the kind of margin that prevents one bad season from becoming collapse. Light usage remained the clearest symbol of this discipline, though it was not treated as symbolism at the time. Lamps burned for tasks, then went out. Streets were not flooded with unnecessary brightness. Homes did not spill light to prove they were awake. Darkness became normal, and normal darkness improved sleep, improved health, improved mood. The city did not celebrate this. It simply benefited. Sound followed the same pattern. Noise ended when function ended. Silence became the default. This was not suppression, it was relief. Quiet nights preserved nerves. Quiet nights reduced conflict. Quiet nights made mornings easier. The city learned that an unbroken cycle is more valuable than a thrilling one. Even authority refused excess in its own way. Patrols existed, but they were not theatrical. Readiness replaced display. Officials withdrew at night and allowed themselves to be human bodies again, subject to fatigue and repair. This may not sound like politics, but it is. A rested administration makes fewer desperate choices. A rested city produces fewer desperate citizens. The mild humor in all of this is that once the habit formed, it required less effort than excess ever did. Excess needs constant justification. It needs constant fuel. It needs constant agreement from tired bodies. Restraint sustains itself. Once people realize that stopping earlier makes tomorrow easier, the argument ends quietly. The city did not need a new ideology. It needed one good night of sleep, repeated until it became normal. By the year 900, Constantinople was still a capital. It still managed trade, diplomacy, administration, defense. It did not retreat into insignificance. It simply refused to waste itself proving it. The city learned that longevity belongs to those who know when to stop. Expansion without rest collapses. Continuity requires refusal. So the night arrived and the city did not fight it. Darkness did not win a battle. It was simply allowed to do its work. The day ended because it was finished. The city dimmed because it could. And in that quiet refusal of excess, Constantinople endured. By the year 900, Constantinople was no longer a city waiting to recover. Recovery had already taken place, quietly, without a moment anyone could point to and say, "This is when it happened." There was no ceremony, no announcement, no visible return of crowds or brilliance. The city stabilized the way a body stabilizes after long illness, slowly, unevenly, and only noticeable once the worst no longer returned. What endured was not an event. It was a rhythm. One long night repeated carefully across years, across generations, until repetition itself became protection. The city did not survive by proving strength. It survived by conserving it. The night that preserved Constantinople was not dramatic. It did not glow with light or echo with sound. It did not demand attention. Doors closed, lamps dimmed, streets emptied, bodies lay down. Morning arrived. Then the same sequence happened again. Nothing remarkable occurred, and that was precisely the point. Before the plague, the city had believed that continuity required constant motion. Trade needed noise. Authority needed visibility. Life needed to announce itself. After loss, these assumptions became liabilities. The city learned that constant demonstration drains the very systems it tries to protect. The long night allowed the city to stop demonstrating. Darkness became permission rather than threat. People no longer felt compelled to fill every hour with activity. Rest stopped being something earned after exhaustion and became something scheduled by habit. This mattered more than any policy. A city that rests predictably reduces error. Fewer accidents occur. Fewer conflicts escalate. Bodies heal before they break completely. The night became the city's most reliable form of maintenance. The plague did not disappear from memory, but it stopped dictating daily behavior. Fear faded into caution, caution into routine, routine into stability. The night absorbed what daylight strained. Generations grew up within this rhythm without being taught it explicitly. Children learned that night meant home, not danger. Darkness meant quiet, not abandonment. Silence meant continuity. They inherited habit rather than trauma. Homes held this transformation more than any institution. Walls contained rest. Interiors softened. Sleep deepened. The city learned that recovery happens indoors, away from spectacle. Streets resting at night allowed homes to function as places of repair. Streets themselves changed meaning. They no longer existed to host constant movement. They existed to connect spaces during the day and to rest at night. Empty streets did not signal failure. They signaled balance. Authority adapted as well. Officials withdrew at night. Decisions waited for morning. Governance slowed without weakening. In fact, it improved. Rested minds make fewer irreversible mistakes. Commerce followed the same logic. Trade became predictable rather than frantic. Markets opened and closed with the sun. Excess hours were abandoned. Profits stabilized. Waste declined. Continuity replaced urgency. The city learned that exhaustion is expensive. It shortens lives. It damages tools. It erodes judgment. Rest, by contrast, accumulates quietly. One good night does little. Thousands change everything. The long night did not eliminate danger, it reduced exposure to it. Fewer people outside meant fewer injuries. Reduced noise meant fewer confrontations. Darkness shortened the hours when chaos thrives. Risk became manageable instead of omnipresent. This was not naivety. Guards still walked, doors still closed, fires were still watched. But vigilance stopped being theatrical. Safety no longer depended on constant motion. It depended on restraint. Visitors sometimes misread this calm. A sleeping city can look unimpressive to those expecting brilliance. Constantinople did not correct the misunderstanding. Survival does not require applause. The night also reshaped memory. Without constant novelty, days blended gently together. Trauma softened. Loss stopped being rehearsed daily. Healing continued invisibly. There is a temptation in history to search for decisive moments, a reform, a victory, a rebirth. Constantinople offers a quieter lesson. Survival can be cumulative, not dramatic. It can come from refusing to escalate. The city did not defeat darkness. It partnered with it. Darkness removed unnecessary labor. Darkness shortened days. Darkness restored bodies. Darkness became infrastructure. This partnership required humility. The city had to accept its limits. It had to stop pretending that unlimited activity was possible or desirable. Once that pretense ended, stability followed. The long night did not weaken Constantinople. It aligned it. Systems stopped competing. Homes matched bodies. Bodies matched night. Night matched season. The city stopped fighting itself. Children born into this rhythm did not know anything else. For them, a city that slept was normal. They did not romanticize exhaustion. They did not expect constant stimulation. This shaped temperament for generations. Even celebration benefited. Because nights were usually quiet, festivals stood out. Light and sound regained meaning through rarity. Joy became sharper, not duller. Illness recovery improved. Rest became treatment. People were allowed to heal without being rushed back into labor. The city learned that forcing productivity too early only prolongs weakness. Over time, the city became less anxious. Anxiety feeds on irregularity and noise. Predictable quiet reduces it. The long night smoothed the city's nervous system. Nothing about this transformation required ideology. No one wrote treatises about rest. No banners praised darkness. The city simply noticed what worked and repeated it. This is why the long night rarely appears in chronicles. Chroniclers record what happens. They do not record what does not happen. They do not write about nights without conflict, days without collapse, years without emergency. And yet these were the nights that mattered most. Constantinople remained standing not because it stayed awake longer than other cities, but because it learned when to stop. It allowed the day to end. It allowed darkness to arrive. It allowed people to disappear indoors without shame. Morning returned without being chased. The city waited for it. Waiting became strength. The long night was not one night. It was thousands. Each one ordinary. Each one sufficient. Together they formed a system strong enough to carry the city forward. This is how Constantinople survived. Not through brilliance, not through noise, not through excess, but through one long night, repeated carefully until endurance no longer needed to be announced.